We'll go ahead and start on our webinar today. I want to welcome everyone to the program. This is number 4 of our ongoing weekly series on farm solar PV training. We've touched on a number of topics so far. If you were unable to join us in previous weeks, I encourage you to go to the Maryland Energy Extension website, and you can find recordings of past sessions there. We've talked about an overview of Maryland's solar market, some solar PV basics. I think last week we touched on design work and how to size a solar PV system. So a number of topics, and then we will have continuing sessions going on through into December. So I encourage you again to go to the Maryland Energy Extension website and get more information about those programs and other upcoming programs. But with that said, today's session, session number 4 is dealing with regulations, permitting, zoning, ordinances, types of issues. We'll kind of touch on, I think, both small scale systems that'll support your own energy use, as well as some of the larger utility scale operations. We'll kind of touch on both of those topics. The utility scale are those systems that are, multiple megawatts. In Maryland, it'd be probably over 2 megawatts as far as the Public Service Commission's concerned. But we'll talk about different scales and talk about some of the common concerns that are associated with solar. If your neighbor is installing solar, or how your neighbors will perceive that solar. Being that this is an on-farm series, we'll talk primarily from an agricultural standpoint, but I think it has a lot of applicability to residential, commercial, and other applications of solar PV. So we're still having some folks join the webinar. I'll start before we get into the content just with an introduction. For those of you that have participated in previous sessions, you may recognize me. My name is Drew Chavone. I'm an energy extension specialist with the University of Maryland. My work is primarily in agricultural energy, conservation, efficiency, and a variety of technologies, including solar photovoltaics, and the content of our discussion today. And so we do a number of programs in this area, solar and others. Again, you can find out more about the energy programs we do on the website that you should have on your screen. And we're also joined here today by Paul Geringer from Agricultural and Resource Economics Department with the University of Maryland. Paul, I don't know if you want to chime in at any point and kind of share what your background is. I know you've done a lot with agricultural leases and other issues and agricultural law. But I don't know if you want to share more about that and connect with us with some of your resources as well.
Yeah, so thanks, Drew. Like Drew said, I've done a lot with agricultural leases. I've done a little bit more with utility scale solar leasing as well, and some of the issues that go into that. This has been more fun to sort of learn some of the issues that go into residential and on-farm uses for it as well. But you need legal resources or information, we have a bunch of other topics the folks I work with have covered. It's at umagglaw.org, or it's on the extension website. There's an ag law page, and you can click and you can get to those as well from there.
Okay, well, fantastic. Thanks, Paul, for being here. As I said, let's, I guess before we do that, I'll give some instructions and guidance on Zoom. I think we're all becoming kind of comfortable with this technology, but the Q&A feature is where we will take the questions that you have, and we'll try to leave adequate time towards the end of our hour today to answer those questions. The chat feature, if that's not working, it's probably been disabled. So again, just try to get those questions into the Q&A. And of course, I think both Paul and I are available offline as well. We can provide our contact information if you want to reach out to us apart from this program. I'll mention now as well that the program's being recorded. As I mentioned, all of these sessions of this series are posted on the Maryland Energy Extension website. This one will be recorded as well and posted there. It'll take a day or two for it to appear. So if you miss part of it, you can find it there. I'm going to open up a survey here just so that we can gain an understanding of who's on the program with us today. There's 2 questions that you should see. If you could take a moment and just indicate what industry you're joining us from. And question 2 would be any specific topics related to our solar discussion today that you might be interested in, specific applications. So take a minute, answer those questions, and then I think you need to click the submit button. And when that's complete, we'll start on some of our program today. Okay, I'll give another 10 seconds or so. Okay, I'm going to close that out. Thank you everyone for answering that question. Kind of a quick overview of what we'll touch on today. I'm going to start with just a couple minutes here, giving an overview of Maryland's energy initiatives and policies that have been put in place. As you'll see kind of from the discussion, Maryland's really emphasized solar among other renewables, but there's a big push for it. And in some ways, Maryland's kind of got to play catch up with the ambitious goals that they've set for renewable energy. And so we'll kind of get to some of those issues later, permitting and ordinances and other things like that. But I just wanted to start, and we've talked about some of this in previous weeks, but for those of you that weren't able to join us, we'll kind of touch back on these topics. And arguably one of the most important initiatives for solar development in the state is the Renewable Portfolio Standard, or RPS. And so we don't have a federal program that dictates how much renewable energy we use. It's mandated on a state level. And so these are laws put into place on a state-by-state basis. If you can tell from the map there, Maryland is, and this goes back to 2019 at the last update to our RPS, but we've mandated that 50% of our electricity come from renewable sources. That's including solar PV, but other technologies as well. There's other states up there that have other, more ambitious goals, even more so than Maryland. You see District of Columbia, it's at 100% by the year 2030, I think that is, 2032. Yeah, it's kind of a different land area than Maryland is, but just to give you an idea, a lot of states have adopted these. Some of them are not called RPS, some of them have a different acronym there, but for the most part, these are state level mandates that if you're producing, a utility is producing electricity, they have to make sure that a certain percent, in Maryland's case, 50% will need to come from renewables. And that would include, as I said, solar, wind, and other things. This is just a quick overview of legislation that's taken place going back to 2004. So it's kind of been a short history, less than 20 years, but we started, if the far left on 2004, we were at, what's that, 3.5%. At the time, that was kind of ambitious, but we've moved that up. In 2019, again, that was another increase, taking us to 50%. And what's unique about this is we do include a solar carve out. 14.5% has to come from solar. So this is, particularly relevant to our discussion today, is really pushing the state, pushing forward in solar development. And again, now we're having to kind of keep up with that in terms of permitting and where these the solar installations are put in. So that's one aspect. Another aspect I'll touch on is kind of a transaction that happens on the side of that is solar renewable energy credits. And so what these are is it's a separate transaction than the energy actually being transferred back and forth from generation to the use. This is basically a certification or a proof that some of that energy, in the case we're talking about here, solar renewable energy credits, it's proof that 1 megawatt of solar energy was generated as opposed to any other source of energy, whether it be a conventional fossil fuel or whatnot. So if a utility now is required by that state mandate, that RPS in Maryland, to produce renewable electricity, this is a proof that they can do so. And they can either generate this renewable energy themselves, or they can apply or purchase a SREC, the certificate of compliance, essentially, where they have shown that they have either generated the power themselves or purchased it from another. In our case, we're talking about solar developers. So a solar system would produce that 1 megawatt. And so they can comply with that mandate by purchasing these SRECs. Now, the other part of this is, yeah, we can benefit from this if you do install solar. There is this marketplace, this mandate in place where you can buy and trade these SRECs. I'll show just in the graph to the right-hand side how that has kind of responded. This SREC market has responded to RPS goals. So every time one of those mandates, the RPS gets updated, and unfortunately this graph doesn't go up through 2019 when that latest mandate came into place. But when the RPS gets bumped up, it drives the SREC market again. And this is showing other renewable energies as well, but that yellow portion is the solar renewable energy credits. And so that bumps it up. And so, 2 years ago, we were around maybe $20, maybe around $20 or so, where if you look at the information shown here, and this was pulled earlier this week, we're now at about $78. So, and then that's per megawatt hour. So the market has increased significantly. As I said, those mandates bump that SREC market up. One of the concerns that has been going around in Maryland quite a bit is just that a lot of these certificates are from generating facilities outside the state of Maryland. So we're not directly benefiting from the job market that those renewable generation facilities would require. We're not benefiting directly from the environmental aspects of that renewable energy. But some of it's just for various reasons we're buying out of state SRECs. But this kind of gives you an idea of the breakdown regionally within the PJM district. There's other policies that have been put in place in the state and regionally as well. And I won't go into details on all these. I've highlighted some of them. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Act, there's some multi-state RGGI and the TCI, the transportation. They're targeting different industry and transportation sectors, not specifically directly saying solar PV has to be installed. But again, these various initiatives prioritize technologies like solar PV in order to decrease the greenhouse gas emissions. And we've talked about this in the past, and we'll talk about it in the future of this series. But yeah, solar PV has none of those emissions tied to it on site. And so when you're talking about electricity generation from fossil fuels, you have a lot more greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, and other things. So with these various policies put in place in the state and within the region, there's a lot of push towards solar development. So I think we're at around 4.5% solar electricity now, maybe a little less than that. Our goal is to get to 14.5%. So we've got more than 10% climb to go within the next decade. So there's a lot of push for this. And as I have said before, we're going to have to try to keep up with that if we're going to develop that and where these things go, even on a small scale. We do have the utility scale, larger megawatt systems going in, but the residential, the smaller systems do play a part in this as well. One additional aspect I'll just mention briefly, and we've talked about it before, but is net metering, where energy can be transferred back and forth from the grid and back to your site, whether it be a residential or commercial or ag site. If your PV system is not producing electricity at the time, maybe it's nighttime or there's cloud cover, you still have the option to pull electricity back from the grid. What net metering does, and the mandate in Maryland and other states work similarly, you're able to basically, it's kind of a virtual banking system where your utility provider that you're connected to the grid by, they can credit you a certain amount of money based on that transaction, whether you're net positive or negative, depending on how much energy you send and receive. I think we have a, per site is going to be a 2 megawatt capacity or cap. So you can't go over that, or 200% of your annual energy use. Statewide, there's a capacity, I think it's capped at 1,500 megawatts. I'm not sure exactly where we stand close to that, but there are caps on how much you can net meter. You can't send 5 times more energy than you use. And in that case, we get more into what's called utility scale operations and generation sites. So we'll talk on that momentarily. I did want to kind of highlight some different ownership models. The solar leases and the PPA, or the power purchasing agreements. I don't want to get into too much detail right now, but I did want to introduce some of this terminology because we'll touch on it from time to time. But with the solar leasing and the similar PPA, you're not owning the system. And so when we talk about some of these SRECs and other things that you can qualify for as producing electricity, solar leasing and PPA, you don't own the system necessarily. So you're not going to be able to really take advantage of those benefits. What I will say is, if you do own the system, and that obviously requires some investment, and we've talked about it before and we'll talk about it again, but there are a lot of tax incentives still ongoing and other federal and state incentives that'll help bring the cost down. But I just want to point out, as we touch on some of those specifics, that if you don't own your system, there's going to be some things that you just can't necessarily achieve, where if you own the system outright. So that said, I'll issue our next poll a little later, but I did want to get into some of the more in-depth content that we'll touch on today, particularly looking into permitting and some of the considerations that have to go into that in terms of CPCN, if it's a larger site, or we'll talk about some of those different things in interconnection agreements. So I don't know if I can hand this off to Paul, and if you want to share some of your thoughts at this point, we'll kind of bounce back and forth as necessary.
Okay, I can do that. The main thing with this is with small scale solar, anything under 2 megawatts, you really don't have to go out and get special permitting. And you've kind of hinted upon this, Drew. It doesn't require you to go to Public Service Commission and file for a CPCN, a certification of public necessity and public need, I believe is what it stands for. I could be wrong on my acronyms, but you don't have to go through that. The biggest thing you're going to have to start doing, and we'll talk about this, or I will more later in the presentation, is kind of understand how county zoning and planning will work on some of this, because you will need to either check with them. You may have to get a permit, you may not. It just depends on the county. But that's going to be the biggest hurdle you're going to have to go through, and then put in some of the, make sure setbacks are met, and then any of the siting screening requirements. My brain just went blank for a second, but screening requirements and height requirements that could be required will be the biggest issue you have to deal with, especially with small scale on-farm use. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add in on this, Drew, or you're muted.
That helps. No, I think that touches on it a bit, and we'll kind of circle back to this idea quite a bit. So,
and I can't remember if I'm the next slide or.
I don't know. I can talk about this.
Yeah, it just took me a second to remember what all was meant by this.
Yeah. So yeah, I think this kind of touches on it again. That certificate of public convenience and necessity, the CPCN, is for the larger systems, and so you're not going to need this in a small residential or farm system below that requirement. What is going to be required in all cases is setting up an agreement with your utility provider and getting connected to the grid, and there's this interconnection agreement that's going to be required. And now I'll specify, if you're off grid, none of this really applies. If you're completely off grid with a battery system or generator and that's one thing. And obviously, if you're just doing some standalone DC system or something like that, electric fencing or a well pump, this doesn't apply. But what we're talking about is when you're actually tied to the grid system, then anyone tied to the grid system, whether it's a rooftop or ground mounted system, you have this interconnection agreement. And there'll be several steps involved in that. But typically, you're going to have a contractor install a larger system with the grid, and you have to be a master electrician to tie into the grid anyway. And a contractor will usually handle all of this interconnection agreement with you. But you have to go through your utility provider, whoever that's with, and go through that process. And we can look at some of those steps. And I don't know if there's much we can say on a more city or county basis, but there could be specific requirements regionally throughout the state. But most of us are going to have that interconnection agreement to work out. So do you have anything else to add? I'll go to the next.
No, I think you've covered the first part well.
So I guess share this example, and this is for BGE. I mean, if you have another utility provider, you can find information on their website. But this provides some information on how to go through that process from BGE. So if you go to the left-hand menu on their website, there's, and this might change from time to time, but right now, go to the left-hand menu and it'll walk you through choosing an application for connection to the grid. And so they have different levels, and really I think this comes down to how expedited, how quickly that is. There can be delays in this, but you can get more information about what kind of application you would need for that to be grid tied, and then you can apply. Once you get a compliance statement from them, you can go on and do additional steps. So I'll just briefly share some of the steps involved with registering for the SREC market. You know, as a precursor, step number one is just, again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, make sure you own the system. If you don't own the system, you're not going to be able to take advantage of this market. If you do own it, you can. And step two is kind of talking about what I just mentioned with that interconnection agreement and getting a certificate of completion from your utility provider. So whoever you're on is going to have a special application for that. You'll get certified, a certificate from your utility provider. But step 3 and 4, now you're actually applying for the SREC market. Again, this is not talking about the large utility scale systems with the CPCN. This is just talking about registering for this interconnection and to trade with the SREC market. So you go to the Maryland Public Service Commission website. The link is on the slide there. And on the left-hand side of their menu, you should be able to find PV solar certification. You'll have to set up an account there and a login and password, and they'll walk you through the system there. And then finally, you'll register with PJM, and all along you have to prove that you've had this certificate of completion from your utility provider. But you go to the PJM transmission website with the environmental information services, and that website for PJM is on the slide as well. But that's going to be your tracking system, keeping track of all the attributes of where that electricity was generated. And obviously, in our case, it would come from the site that you've installed, and would give all the specifications for that. So that's kind of an overview of some of those aspects, and a lot of that's handled online through those registration processes. Well, at this point, I guess, unless Paul, you had anything else to add to kind of permitting side, I think just exploring those websites probably be beneficial. There's a lot of information on the public service site and Public Service Commission and PJM on that. But at this point, maybe we'll just jump into the issues with ordinances and various concerns. And I think these are kind of topics that come up quite a bit. So I guess I'll hand that over to you.
Okay, thank you. And yeah, these are claims that come up a lot in some of this. And I added this in mainly because as we look at this, sometimes neighbors may have problems with some of this stuff coming in. They may not understand why it's coming in. It may be cited in a way where it may be pointed directly at their property in some way, and they may have concerns of glare in the past. And we have had issues in the past where some neighbors have sued, typically for nuisance. And just for those that are unaware of what a nuisance is, it's this condition or activity or situation. It's a loud noise. It's typically a foul odor. It's something that impacts the use of another person's property. So if your neighbor can no longer utilize their property because of the glare or alleged glare from a solar facility that's on your property, that could be one of the issues that could rise to where a court may say it's a nuisance. It depends on a lot of factors. There is no idea what exactly a nuisance is at times. I often, with my undergrad class, describe it in the way, looking back at how the Supreme Court used to look at what something that was profane was, or what was something like that that we shouldn't see, and often point out nuisance is a lot like it. The Supreme Court once said they knew it when they see it. In this case, they'll know a nuisance when they see it. We may not always know what the nuisance is in some of these cases. But the good thing is, oops, and it's not letting me advance the slides, Drew. Oh, yeah. Not sure what happened there, but yeah, legal claims, typically studies have shown that glare is minimal when they're properly set up, and courts have typically rejected most of the claims involving glare. Very few, if they do go to trial, for the most part, courts have upheld when the cases have been dismissed. It's very hard to prove this, and I think in the next set of slides, you were going to talk about why that is, if I remember correctly, Drew.
Perhaps. Go a minute, I can advance.
Yeah, you may have to, because for some reason it's not letting me. Oh, no. So studies have shown basically that this is minimal. They reject almost all of this. Typically, for the most part, in Maryland with the county codes, there are screening requirements that have to be set up for most of these setback requirements, and a lot of this is going to help prevent a lot of the glare issues. Similar issues come up, not with glare so much, but in wind turbines. We often hear that there are noise issues associated with them, and those nuisance claims also typically don't proceed beyond just a complaint. They're typically rejected, and glare is typically rejected as well, just because siding should take care of this, and the setbacks and screening should take care of most of these issues. I think.
Okay, I can add to this conversation here. And correct me if I'm wrong, Paul, but the way I see a lot of ordinances is not really setting clear definitions with how to test glare. It's kind of left into the developer's hands to prove that the glare is not going to be an issue. And okay. And there's a lot of tools out there. I've included a link to the San Diego website, Gov website. You can see that at the bottom of the slide if you want to learn more about these tools, but a lot of them have been developed from basically a lot of different computer simulations and glare, so they can test different angling and settings and direction, orientation of the panels, and different times of the year. You're going to have different reflection off the panel. So a lot of different simulation models, and a lot of them have been adapted from the aviation industry, and the FAA has kind of spearheaded this. And in a lot of cases, it's like, you know, radius of an airport. But these tools are becoming more and more common for developers to use to go on and simulate glaring effects, and obviously different types of materials are going to have different reflection But the software, a lot of the software that's available allows you to specify the material, the angling, and all that. And on the right-hand side, you'll see kind of an example of a report that'll site close to an airport. But what they've done is they put all the specifications for that system in. They'll look at it in different angling on the sun. But what you should get out is what's on the bottom there. For all of the PV arrays that you have on site, you should have a glare value recorded. So in this case, it's all zeroed out, 0 minutes per year of glare. And they usually specify in the different regions shown on that graph, the green and yellow. We're never really going to see anything in the red region, which goes into permanent eye damage. It's going to be lower in these regions, but really, if it's done properly, like Paul has mentioned, you know, we really shouldn't have issues with this. But this is just another level of verification that it would lie on the developer's hands to make sure that doesn't affect neighboring property or anything like that. It is a little bit more complicated when you have hills and varying terrain to account for, but a lot of these systems will allow you to kind of evaluate that at different capacities. Guess I'll share a little bit from my viewpoint on some of these pictures that we're sharing. The fencing can be required, and I don't know, have you, Paul, seen height requirements on fencing, specific like 8 feet or anything like that? I don't know how often I see that.
I have not seen anything really in the county codes requiring a height requirement on the fencing, but.
Okay. Yeah, I know some states have gotten specific with it, and that's kind of a hard balance to keep up from a, you know, from an ordinance standpoint, keeping up with all possible scenarios that can happen. You know, fencing would be for one of two purposes: to prevent access, so unauthorized access, as well as screening. So the chain link fence on the far left is not providing much screening. You can kind of clearly see through that system. But if you have some kind of a vinyl or some other fencing material that would shade it a little bit more, particularly in that center picture, you know, you have the rolling hills, it's a little bit harder to screen that. What I have seen is kind of compromises go back and forth, particularly with the larger sites that are, you know, back and forth in legal issues. How far back it's set, maybe they compromise bringing the site a little bit closer, but they have additional screening. So there can be some back and forth from what I've seen in terms of fencing and vegetative screening and other things like that. The example on the far right, you'll see, I think it's set back about 100 feet from the roadway. So the picture is taken from the street, and in this case, it's set back 100 feet. And you have a fence there at 100 feet. Actually, the tree line, the vegetative screening starts at about 75 feet. So you have 25 feet of vegetation. And so this is something that you'll see even at a local level, kind of what works from site to site. I think it would be kind of hard to manage this from a universal standpoint across the state, saying that all sites have to have A, B, and C in terms of fence height and that kind of thing. So I do see some benefit to having a site-by-site assessment to be able to set it back. Because like I said, in the middle photograph, even though it does have that screening fence on there, some of it is still visible. And if that is desired to be hidden a little bit more, it'll be a little bit more challenging without that vegetated. And you do see some of that shrubbery being planted there. I know some states have gotten really specific with what types of vegetation can be planted there. I will say this is a really big potential for the nursery industry as more projects go in and there's more screening, vegetative screening. That nursery industry can really benefit from some of those opportunities there to kind of screen those systems. Those pictures just to give you an idea of what some sites will look like depending on local conditions. don't know if you have thoughts on this, Paul.
I do. So the area where we may not see nuisance claims, the area where there are claims that are allowed to go forward, and none of these have been in Maryland, they've been in other states. But it seems reasonable to believe that we may have claims here if this happened too. And a lot of this was with either household, small scale use, or on farm use. So what happens if neighbors develop something that impact your panels, that all of a sudden, as Drew's picture shows, there's a new house that goes in, and now there's what I thought was a good site to collect sun from now has a house. A few courts have found that this obstructed access to solar can be a nuisance, but others have not. It's kind of about 50-50, but some states have. I think it would be reasonable that maybe the right claim would exist in Maryland, that something could come forward. And a lot of this, as I said, depends on facts. So in some of the cases, there were setbacks to where it couldn't be shown that basically the new structure was impacting it enough. In other cases, it was pretty clear that it was. The area where it's probably going to become really clear is if it's something that's done out of spite. We've all heard about the spite fences that may go up when neighbors have disputes. And now there's, the huge, 30-foot fence. And that could lead to problems where you're deliberately trying to impact your neighbors. That's where we're going to have a more clear-cut case. But in some of these, it has been found that obstructed access is a nuisance and you do have a claim. So yeah, so keep in mind with county zoning and planning, you have to take that into account with whatever you plan to do, especially if it's rooftop or ground mount in some way. If it's an electric fence, probably using it to pump water with, that's probably not going to be as big of a deal. But anything bigger than that is going to have to go through county zoning and planning. Maryland county's zoning and planning is somewhat consistent with how small scale is treated. I'm going to, at the end, show you a guide that exists through DNR that will help with some of this, to help you better understand, depending on what your county is, what's required. For the most part, it's allowed in almost all zone districts in most of the counties. There are a few that are not. I see some folks from Garrett County. Garrett County has no zoning and planning, I believe, except for in the cities that are there. It's much easier to deal with there. For the most part, in the other counties, it's allowed in most of the areas where most of the zoning districts. Typically, it's got to be small scale. For the most part, with the counties, that's less than 2 megawatts. 2 megawatts is when you got to start getting in with Public Service Commission. But some counties, Montgomery's one, and there are a few others that were this way. It may be 1 megawatt or less is all they're permitting you to use. It's all going to depend on the county code, but for the most part, the majority of counties were less than 2 megawatts. It's just the few random counties where it may be a sliding scale. Frederick, it was a sliding scale in what would be allowed and what the permitting would be based on just size of the project. And I can try and see if I can advance this. Yeah, so at the end, when we get through the PowerPoint, I'm gonna show some county code examples. But DNR has actually put together a pretty good comprehensive guide of the county zoning requirements for all renewable energy in the state. So it has solar and it has wind in it, and it has utility scale, and it has small scale. So it actually is really helpful, and it includes a Baltimore City in it as well. I would say use the initial guide to kind of figure out what your county's allowing, and then go to the county code just to verify that nothing has changed. And the guide does have some of the county regs. I'll show you how you can click on it here in a minute, and it'll take you to the various deals. And I believe you're getting the PowerPoint at the end. That's where the guide is available at the end. So what do you need to be aware of in the ordinances? What have I seen? And we're going to talk about a few specific issues that have popped up in each of these counties, and I believe those are on the next slides, if I remember correctly. I just got out of teaching my undergrad class, so I've been in ag leases all morning, and now I'm trying to get my mind back into solar. So with the majority of them, like I said, small scale, solar, residential, on farm, whatever it is, it's typically going to be an accessory use under the county code. Oh, we went too far. So an accessory use is one that's dependent on the main use. So if you add solar panels to your farm to provide power to a barn, typically your farm is still a farm because you're still primarily in the production agricultural realm, and your accessory use is energy production. Now you've added solar on, it's an accessory use. If you start taking up the whole property with solar, it slowly becomes not an accessory use, it's the primary use, and then we have to figure out if this primary use is zoned for the area. But for the most of this small scale solar, it's going to fit within these accessory uses. So, like I said earlier, a number of the counties limit the size. It's typically less than 2 megawatts, but check with the county code just to make sure that's still correct. In your county, it may differ in some of them. I know Montgomery, Frederick, it is a different setup, but for the most, it's 2 megawatts in restriction. But just check to make sure what you're putting in, the size will fit within the code. If you're working with a developer who's going to put it on the roof or on a barn or something to where it's probably going to go back into the market, they're probably going to know what the requirements are and will probably work with you to make sure it's within that size, but it is worth paying attention to, especially if you're doing it on your own and it's going to be on farm use only and you're not looking at going into the market. Oh, did I go too far? Oh, no, that's correct. Okay. So, and I think I can stop sharing your screen if I.
Okay. Let's give it a shot.
Oh. That did not work. It is not letting me stop sharing your screen, so you may have to stop sharing it.
Okay, I think I have. My computer's moving a little slow today, so.
Okay.
Let's see, has it stopped? No.
It has not stopped. Oh, wait, now it paused. Ah, now I can. If I am doing this right, you guys should be seeing the Carroll County code for solar energy facilities. If not, you're seeing a story about Roundup, but
well, I don't have it on my end, but like I said, I'm having a little computer. I might have to.
Okay. I'm gonna pretend we're sharing the right screen. So with this, well, let me start off with the county zoning guide. So this is the DNR guide that I talked about earlier up at the top. Just get rid of this. They put it together for renewable energy. It is really good. It's a comprehensive guide that was put together. So I'll click on Carroll County. You can go in here, you can click on the link to the Carroll County document, and it'll start giving you sort of the overview. It'll lay out what section 158, which I have, or chapter 158, which I have opened on another screen. I'll show you this in a second. If you don't want to go to this and you know the county code already, we can go here, but it's a good document to get started on. It will tell you sort of what you need to know for small scale solar. It's an accessory use permitted in all zoning districts. If you need more information on that, you can go to your county code. You automatically know it's in chapter 158. It makes the research part of this much easier. I've already gone into the Carroll County Code and found it. But if it's zoned residential or commercial, these are some of the setback lot requirements depending on size for that. If it's ag, it talks about what's required and all of that. The setbacks are generally consistent with other uses in that zoning district. There is a height requirement if it's ground mounted, I believe. No, it's for all things. It's got to be, shall extend more than 10 feet from the highest portion of the principal structure. You do need to keep in mind these height requirements. There may be other requirements just to get the permit to do this. If it's going to be interconnected, you need something from conditional approval from the local utility. Keep in mind some of the things you're going to have to do. Glare is up to the installer on how that's done. I've also done this with Montgomery just to give you sort of some of the examples. We can go back to the deal if you want to figure out how to do it. Montgomery has a little bit more clear what's allowed in ag and what's not to think about. Typically, it just needs some written authorization again from the count or from the utility and taking that into account. And then this would be another example, Talbot, of just looking at it through the guide. But I will say the guide that DNR's put together is a good guide to sort of start the process and start figuring it out. If not, you got to go through, you may have to suffer through searching through your county code just to figure this out. And it may be an easier way to sort of do it. And I can stop sharing my screen now, Drew.